Siona, God, hello all, Ostis and Ali. Good morning, Wado. Thank you for watching. So this is day 11, part A of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. And I'm going to try and make up for missing out on these things, but I promise you I had good reason. All right, let's see. But the audiences for their stories were in the West, not in the Islamic countries where they had been enslaved. Moreover, the stories of white slaves in the Islamic world were of interest only in the West of their time, not in the West of our time, when such experiences are largely passed over in silence. Like other historical facts that do not fit today's visions and agendas, direct observation of the treatment of slaves was less common with domestic slaves living behind walls or galley slaves hidden in the bowels of ships, as distinguished from plantation slaves working out in open fields. However, what was directly observable in the Islamic world were the slave caravans, which marched vast numbers of human beings from their homes where they had been captured to the places where they would be sold, hundreds of miles away, often after spending months crossing the burning sands of the Sahara. Oh my God. The death toll on these marches exceeded even the horrific toll on packed slave ships. Oh my gosh, really? Okay, so it's saying that this was worse than being packed like sardines in them slave ships. Remember how we saw growing up, they showed us the layout of how they would pack in the slaves and the living conditions there and stuff. Like there would be like poop and pee and vomit down there and everything. Okay, hang on. The death toll on these marches exceeded even the horrific toll on packed slave ships crossing the Atlantic. Slaves who could not keep up with the caravans were abandoned in the desert and left to die a lingering death from heat, thirst, and hunger. Thousands of human skeletons were strewn along one Saharan slave route alone. Have you ever heard of these slave routes? Because I've never, not until right now, have I ever heard of that. Mostly the skeletons of young women and girls who were more in demand than men in much of the Islamic world. That's nasty. These skeletons tended to cluster in the vicinity of wells, suggesting their last desperate efforts to reach water. Wow. A letter from an Ottoman official in 1849 referred to 1,600 black slaves dying of thirst on their way to Libya. It has been estimated that for every slave to reach Cairo alive, several died on the way. Whether or not the survivors were later treated better or worse than slaves in the Western Hemisphere after reaching their final destinations is by no means the whole story. While much of the history of the treatment of slaves has been presented as a history of the treatment of African slaves, the treatment of European slaves in North Africa and elsewhere was by no means benign. For example, this was the scene in 18th century Algiers, Algiers, as newly captured European slaves were paraded through town. Since the arrival of new slaves was a sign of prosperity and an occasion of civic pride for all the townsfolk, the resident Turks, Moors, Moors, Jews, and renegades all turned out to cheer and taunt the newcomers. Local children especially followed the slaves as they shuffled along, loudly humiliating them and sometimes threw refuse at them. Refuse. The newly captured men's heads and beards were roughly shaved bare as part of the demoralization process to break their spirit, and slaves of either sex could be stripped naked for sale at auction. Most of the female slaves were used for domestic work, but the men tended to be used for work requiring strength, including the brutal and degrading work of galley slaves. When the ship was idle, slaves who needed to relieve themselves could make their way to the opening at the hull side of their bench, known as the borda, B-O-R-D-A, dragging their part of the chain and presumably climbing over their sleeping companions. End quotes. The only liberty that is given us in the galley, end quote, recalled Louis Marot, M-A-R-O-T-T, end quotes, is to go to this place when we have occasion, end quote. This, however, many slaves were apparently too exhausted or dispirited to do, and often ended up simply fouling themselves where they sat. The resulting stench, as many observers agreed, was beyond belief, but besides the fumes in which they labored, the shackled Gaeoti, G-A-E-O-T-T-I, were also tormented by rats, fleas, bedbugs, and other parasites. In the middle of the 16th century, galleys propelled by the rowing of slaves were common in the Mediterranean among both Europeans and their Islamic neighbors and enemies. In their epic naval battle of Lepanto, Lepanto, in 1571, an estimated 80,000 rowers propelled the galleys of the warring powers, and these rowers were mostly slaves. The need for galley slaves later declined as Europeans first began to rely on sails for power, so that by the late 1600s, galley slaves were found primarily in vessels from North Africa and the Middle East. Later, as sails became more common on Mediterranean vessels from the Islamic countries as well, the hideous work of galley slaves also declined. While North African pirates enslaved Europeans, primarily from the countries around the Mediterranean, they occasionally ranged much farther afield. Some of these pirates sailed into the English Channel and even into the Thames estuary. A 17th century British parliamentary report said, in quote, "The fishermen are afraid to put to sea, and we are forced to keep continual watch on all our coasts," end quote. Nevertheless, Algerians were estimated to have captured more than 350 British ships between 1672 and 1682, which would mean that they enslaved a few hundred Britons, Britons, annually. Earlier in 1627, these pirates ranged even farther afield and raided Iceland, carrying off nearly 400 people into bondage. As late as the early 19th century, Barbary, Barbary, pirates captured American ships on the high seas and enslaved their crews. The phrase, end quote, "to the shores of Tripoli," end quote, is the U.S. Marine Corps hymn because Marines were part of a naval expedition sent to rescue hundreds of Americans from bondage in North Africa and serve as a warning against further pirate attacks on American ships. I was just about to say, "Ura." Anyway, not all the captured Europeans became slaves. Some were ransomed, as were Americans. After a successful raid on a European coast, the pirates sometimes sailed out of sight and then returned a day or two later under a white flag to offer to sell some of their captives back to their families. This was especially effective when the captives were children or youths who might be brought before their parents in the custody of a fearsome and leering Moor, M-O-O-R, to leave no doubt what awaited them in slavery, perhaps even before they arrived in Barbary. Oh, Lord. The story of how human beings treat other human beings when they have unbridled power over them is seldom a pretty story or even a decent story, regardless of the color of the people involved. When the roles were reversed, Africans did not treat Europeans any better than Europeans treated Africans. Neither can be exempted from moral condemnation applied to the other. Anachronistic morality. Moral principles may be timeless, but moral choices can be made only among the options actually available at particular times and places. By the time the existence of slavery became an issue in the Western world of the late 18th century, the question was no longer whether such an institution should be created in the first place, but what to do now. Now that both that institution and millions of people brought from Africa by that institution were already inside Western societies, such as the newly created United States. It was possible to abolish the institution, but it was not possible to abolish the people. That simple, inescapable fact underlay the tangled and torturous history of the issue of slavery in 19th century America, where circumstances made the moral issue more acute than in most other Western nations, while it was no moral issue at all outside the West. End quote. Deep-rooted prejudices were entertained by the whites, end quote, Thomas Jefferson said, and, end quote, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, end quote, made the peaceful coexistence of these two large populations of the South unlikely in his judgment. More likely, he thought, were, end quote, convulsions which will probably never end, but in the extermination of the one or the other race, end quote. James Madison likewise referred to the, end quote, repugnance of the whites, end quote, to blacks, which he saw as, end quote, founded on prejudices themselves, founded on physical distinctions, which are not likely soon, if ever, to be eradicated, end quote. Therefore, like many other opponents of slavery in their day, Jefferson and Madison saw emancipation as something that needed to be combined with expatriation in order to solve the problem of slavery without creating a bigger problem of a race war. The race war and bloodbath that erupted with the emancipation of the blacks in Santo Domingo, today's Haiti, cast a long shadow over the South, and apprehensions were increased when Nat Turner's uprising in 1831 left a trail of death in Virginia before it was suppressed by lethal force. Many Americans of that era who saw slavery as evil saw a race war as a greater evil. Those who took this view had the most difficult moral choices to make and were most inclined to want to grope toward some plan that would erase slavery out of existence without consuming blacks and whites alike in mutually annihilating strife. The founders and early leaders of the American Republic, including Southerners like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, saw slavery as an evil that could be tolerated only in fear of greater evils, and even then not tolerated indefinitely. Among prominent Southerners of later era, Robert E. Lee likewise declared in 1856 that he regarded slavery as an evil that he wished to see somehow gradually ended. Too often the reductionism of a later age has turned all such hesitation about immediate emancipation into either rationalizations for continued economic exploitation or sheer hypocrisy. These charges need to be examined carefully rather than being accepted or rejected as priori. Few who actually lived in antebellum America thought that slavery could be ended in the South by simple fiat, even though it was abolished that way without incident in most northern states. The situation was radically different in the two parts of the country. Slaves were only a relatively minor part of the northern population, and a plantation slavery was virtually unknown, partly because the climate and soil did not lend themselves to the kinds of crops that could be grown efficiently on cotton plantations in the South or on sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Therefore, in the North, the question of abolishing slavery as an institution did not raise serious questions about what to do with the people who had been enslaved. Some affluent whites in the North lost their black household servants or rehired them as employees or sold them to the South, where slavery was still prevalent. But the relatively small numbers of people involved meant that it was not a major problem for the North in any case. Southerners faced a very different situation with momentous economic and social implications. Blacks were a much higher percentage of the total Southern population than in the Northern states, and in some places were an absolute majority. From the first census of 1790 to the last census before the Civil War in 1860, slaves were approximately 1/3 of the total Southern population. As of 1860, slaves were more than 40% of the population of Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and Louisiana, and more than half of the population of Mississippi and South Carolina. Freeing in their midst millions of people of an alien race and an unknown disposition, and with no history in either Africa or America that would prepare them to be citizens of a society such as the United States, was not an experiment that many were willing to risk in these states, not when it would mean risking their lives. Only those on opposite ends of the spectrum of opinion found the issue of slavery easy. Those like Senator John C. Calhoun, Calhoun, of South Carolina, who wished to keep blacks enslaved indefinitely. And those like Massachusetts' William Lloyd Garrison, who advocated immediate emancipation of blacks with the full rights of citizenship. Ironically, both men reasoned on the basis of abstract principles, legalistic principles in the case of Calhoun and moralistic principles in the case of Garrison. In both cases, the relentless march of their syllogisms, syllogisms, left the painful human realities and dilemmas fading into the dim background. For the majority of Americans in between, neither option was acceptable, nor was any other option able to command a general consensus. The kind of strange cross currents this situation generated were perhaps epitomized by the career of Congressman John Randolph of Virginia, a prominent and bitter opponent of the abolitionists, who nevertheless hated slavery. Slavery was to him, quote unquote, a cancer, but one which, in quotes, must not be tampered with by quacks who never saw the disease or the patient, end quote. For this could end in the race war that he too feared threatening, in quotes, the life's blood of the little ones. which are lying in their cradles in happy ignorance of what is passing around them, and not the white ones only, for shall not we too kill? Man, the way they spoke back then. I'm just saying. In happy ignorance of what is passing around them, and not the white ones only, for shall not we too kill? End quote. Fears of a race war were not confined to Southerners, however, or even to Americans. Alexis de Tocqueville, Tocquevilla, saw a race war in the South as a very real possibility in the wake of mass emancipation, and one of many painful prospects created by the institution of slavery, especially a slavery in which the freed people and their descendants would be physically distinct and could not readily vanish by assimilation into the larger society as in some earlier times and in other parts of the world. Moreover, slavery was a very poor preparation for freedom for blacks, economically, socially, or otherwise. Free blacks were already very disproportionately represented in prison populations, creating fears of what would happen if the much larger slave population were suddenly freed. Oh, I get that. Huh. I mean, that makes sense. Even a northern opponent of slavery like Frederick Law Olmsted, having encountered and been appalled by slave field hands during his travels through the South, feared that their, end quote, presence in large numbers must be considered a dangerous circumstance to a civilized people, end quote. He urged charitable efforts toward blacks after they were freed, lest, end quote, quote unquote, desperate want make them dangerous to those around them. But he too saw the freeing of millions of people unprepared for freedom as creating a serious danger to the society as a whole. Nor was Olmsted alone. Abolitionists were hated in the North as well as the South. William Lloyd Garrison narrowly escaped being lynched by a mob in Boston, even though there were no slaveholders in Massachusetts, and another abolitionist leader was killed by a mob in Illinois. Abolitionists were also targets of mobs in New York and Philadelphia, and anti-abolitionist rallies were held in many northern communities. That literally had to be like a super scary time, because like, think about it. If you have a ton of people that are under control somewhat, right? And then, but like they're not showing, like once they're freed or whatever, they're not showing that they can assimilate into society. Like, what do you do with that? Like, that'd be scary. It'd be like, I don't know if it's nice to say or whatever, but it would be like the equivalent of them like releasing all of the prisoners from, like, I don't know, Texas penal institutions or something. And then people are like, we don't know what's going to happen, right? So that's going to be, I don't know if that's the right comparison, but you understand what I'm saying. None of this was based on any economic interest in their ownership of slaves in states where such ownership had been outlawed decades earlier. But just as Southerners resented dangers to themselves created by distant abolitionists, so Northerners resented dangers to the Union with the prospect of a bloody civil war. Even people who were openly opposed to slavery were often also opposed to the abolitionists. A leading historian of the Civil War era has called it a, quote unquote, a moot question whether even such leaders of the fight against slavery as Charles Sumner, Sumner, or Thaddeus, Thaddeus Stevens, Stevens, could be called abolitionists in the sense in which the term was used at the time. Quakers who had spearheaded the anti-slavery movement on both sides of the Atlantic nevertheless distanced themselves from the abolitionist movement exemplified by Garrison. Abraham Lincoln likewise was never an abolitionist in the sense in which that word was used at the time, even though he publicly argued for an end to slavery for decades before he was in a position to put an end to it himself. When he first ran for president in 1860, abolitionists refused to support him, saying that the outcome of this election would make no difference, end quotes, whether success be to the Democrats or the Republicans, end quote. Accordingly, the abolitionists ran their own candidate for president, even though he had no realistic chance of being elected, and in fact split the anti-slavery vote, so that Lincoln was elected with only a plurality, Plurality, Plurality. Donde cogen que we meet again, love you, mean it.